Parliament also passes the Quartering Act. The act of quartering is when the troops from Britain will be required to stay with the colonists. More importantly, the colonists are required to provide food and living quarters for these British soldiers who are stationed in the colonies. Then you have the Stamp Act. In an effort to raise funds to support British military forces in the colonies, it's Lord Grenville who turned to this tax, which was long used in England. The Stamp Act, which is enacted by Parliament in 1765, required that revenue stamps be placed on most printed paper in the colonies. This would include all legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, advertisements. It's the first direct tax collected from those who use the goods, paid by the people in the colonies. And that's different than the earlier taxes, which were on goods that are imported into the colonies. Most of the taxes that were imported into the colonies were paid by merchants, so not directly paid by the colonists. It's people in every colony who reacted with fury and indignation to the news of the Stamp Act. This is when Patrick Henry comes out, and he expressed the sentiments of many when he stood up in the House of Burgesses to demand that the King's government recognize the rights of all citizens. He demanded that there be no taxation without representation. Protest against the Stamp Act will take a violent turn eventually with the founding of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. These are secret societies that are organized for the purpose of intimidating tax agents. This political cartoon here shows the tarring and feathering of John Malcolm, a famous tax agent. So and this is Sam Adams, members of this society will often tar and feather revenue officials. They'll also destroy revenue stamps. Boycotts against British imports are the most effective form of protest during this time. This political cartoon is actually making fun of the Daughters of Liberty as they're signing a non-importation agreement, a boycott agreement. This is a political cartoon created by the British to make fun of these women who are in this cartoon portrayed as frivolous, not good at watching their children, not very attractive, a little promiscuous. So it's not supporting the Daughters of Liberty. But these ideas of boycott agreements become very fashionable in the colonies in 1765 and into 1766. And they say that people will not purchase any article of British origin. Then, faced with a sharp drop in trade, London merchants will have to put pressure on Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. So Parliament does. In 1766, Grenville was replaced by another prime minister, and then Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. What they do instead is they pass kind of like a face-saving measure known as the Declaratory Act. This act asserted that Parliament had the right to tax and make laws for the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever, end quote. This declaration of policy would really be misunderstood by the colonists, and it sort of ends up exacerbating the conflict that already exists. So because of the British government's need for revenue, the new chancellor is going to propose a different tax measure, these Townshend Acts. The Townshend program in 1767 includes taxes to be collected on colonial imports of tea, glass, and paper. The law also requires that the revenues raised be used to pay Crown officials in the colonies. That makes them independent of the colonial assemblies that had previously paid for their salaries. So the Townshend duties will provide for the search of private homes for smuggled goods, in addition to taxing all kinds of everyday items that the colonists use. And it also is going to cause more troops to come over and have to be quartered with the colonists. At first, the colonists are not really protesting the taxes under the Townshend Acts because they're indirect taxes. Tea, glass, and paper taxes that are going to be paid by the merchants at the ports, as opposed to direct taxes on consumer goods. Eventually, however, a few colonial leaders will start arguing forcefully against the new taxes. So in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, John Dickinson agreed that Parliament could regulate commerce, but he argued that because duties were a form of taxation, they could not be levied on the colonists without the consent of their representative assemblies. Dickinson argued that the principle of no taxation without representation was an essential principle of English law. And then later, James Otis and Samuel Adams will jointly write something called the Massachusetts Circular Letter, and they'll send copies to every colonial legislature. It will urge the various colonies to petition Parliament to repeal those Townshend Acts. And British officials in Boston will order the letter retracted. They'll threaten to dissolve the legislature. They will yet again increase the number of British troops in Boston. The colonists will continue to conduct boycotts of British goods. Merchants will increase their smuggling activities to avoid the Townshend Acts. So in London, one more time, they start voting to repeal the law. And as people are protesting more and more, Parliament repeals the law and instead passes a small tax on tea to sort of save face. The repeal of the Townshend Acts happens in 1770, and it ends the colonial boycott, except for this incident that happens in March of 1770, which will eventually be called the Boston Massacre. So the Boston Massacre happens in March of 1770. The people of Boston generally resented the British troops who had been quartered in their city to protect customs officials from being attacked by those Sons of Liberty. It's in March of 1770 that a group of colonists were harassing the guards near the customs house. The guards fired into the crowd. They ended up killing 5 people, including an African American named Crispus Attucks. The troops will be tried for murder. They'll be defended by John Adams, and they'll be acquitted. Adams' cousin is Sam Adams, who will kind of angrily denounce the shooting incident as a massacre. And this famous engraving called the Bloody Massacre perpetrated at King Street, which is credited to Paul Revere, though evidence suggests that he actually plagiarized this from a work by his apprentice Henry Pelham. But it's sent throughout the colonies. So with an engraving, a silver engraving, you can stamp this onto a number of printed materials. And so you can see that it's showing a crowd of British soldiers who are firing at these unarmed colonists, and they're standing in front of Butcher's Hall by the customs house, and it seems like a grossly unfair fight. And you've got these bloody guys in the street and a sad little dog. And this is sent throughout the colonists, kind of like propaganda, to really exacerbate the plight that the British have imposed on the Bostonians. So, there's even more conflict that arises as a result of this. One of the principal devices for spreading opposition to the British is the committees of correspondence that were initiated by Sam Adams. In Boston and other Massachusetts towns, Adams started this practice of organizing committees that would regularly exchange letters about suspicious or potentially threatening British activities. The Virginia House of Burgesses took the concept a step further, and they started to create these committees. One incident that was frequently discussed in the committee's letters was that of the Gaspee. This is a British customs ship that had been successful in catching a number of smugglers. In 1772, the ship ran aground